there's no, on that level, there's no.
Yes. Yes.
So, and that's something you can see that these are things which many people are more about than yes, yeah. It's all perfectly. It's all personal encounter with the state. Yeah, sure. It's grand idea. Yeah, well, it'd be nice to have both of them. Yeah, it's like these kind of high principles and good sources.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I congratulate you on penetrating the outer defences of the British Academy, which seem to be even more complex than they used to be in the old days. It's a singularly uninviting front door now, which you have to push. I'm delighted to welcome you and to welcome Kerem Öktem as our speaker this evening. Kerem is a research fellow at St Anthony's College, Oxford, and he teaches Middle East politics at the Oriental Institute at Oxford. He's pretty much an Oxford person, it's fair to say. I think he did his undergraduate degree at Oxford, and he also completed his doctorate at Oxford. I've known Kerem for several years and had the benefit of his insights and intellect at the CSOX series of seminars in Oxford. CSOX is the Southeast Europe Studies at Oxford seminar series, which Kerem is very much a leading light, and so I can guarantee you on the basis of my experience that you're going to have an interesting and insightful evening. He will speak for about 35 minutes and then has kindly agreed to answer questions. And just before he does speak, I should say that these days, as we head progressively into modern Turkish issues as well as old ones, I ought to say that what our speakers say, of course, is their own opinion, and their views are their own. We provide the forum, but we're not partisan, and we're delighted to, however, to offer a forum like this for discussion of books like Kerem, which I commend to you. I don't think he's actually got copies here to sell at the end, but in any case, get hold of them. I'm sure you'll want to after you've listened to him. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. Is it switched on? Okay, excellent. Well, it's great to be back in the UK again because I actually was in Cairo yesterday for another event for a conference, which was held at the Al-Ahram Center of Strategic Studies. Al-Ahram is one of the main newspapers, and the title was "The Arab Revolutions and Democratic Transition: The Lessons of the Turkish Experience." And my role there, or myself, defined role was to give a critical take on Turkey's experience, but I seemed to have little chance. I had to represent a critical perspective against the audience of Egyptian scholars and political activists, from Islamists to liberals and secularists, who were disagreeing on literally everything, but converged on one idea, and that was that Turkey should be their model of a genuine democracy in a Muslim country. Now, the irony is that at the same time, the Supreme Election Council in Turkey and a court in Diyarbakir were just declaring the parliamentary seats of some members of the Kurdish and Socialist bloc null and devoid. There is now a chance that the other Kurdish MPs might boycott the parliament, which will create a very serious challenge to the democratic process. And this manifest contradiction between two completely different explanatory perspectives, a model versus constant tension and conflict, goes really straight to the heart of the issues I'm discussing in Angry Nation. On the one hand, Turkey has been a welcoming, easygoing country, more liberal, obviously, than any of its Middle Eastern neighbors, and also more democratic than most of its neighbors. If you have lived and worked in Turkey, you will probably have left the country with mostly good memories. On the other hand, in the 30 years which I cover in Angry Nation, more than 40,000 people were killed in politically motivated violence, from the Kurdish war to confrontations between demonstrators and security forces, and 40,000 is a very large number. Based on this contradictory state of affairs, I can preemptively answer the title question, whether Turkey is still an angry nation. Yes, I think Turkey is still an angry nation, and it is likely to remain so without a full transition to liberal democracy and without addressing some of the issues I will be talking about today. But before giving too many answers, let me lay out 4 questions which will structure this presentation. Firstly, I'll try to discuss why I felt the need to write this book. Secondly, which angle on Turkey's recent history I suggest, and what the themes are which are crucial for a critical inquiry into Turkey's history. Thirdly, I'll talk about methodologies and what kind of data collection can be used for such a critical inquiry. And then finally, I will give you a very brief synopsis of the main structural political forces and actors which I see at work in Turkey and which I believe are ensuring, among other things, that Turkey remains an angry nation. So, firstly, why did I write this book? I've studied modern Middle Eastern studies at Oxford, as David has said, and then continued with my DPhil on Turkish nationalism in the following years after 2000. So throughout these years, I've actually searched for a book that would give me a concise overview of Turkey's political and social dynamics of the last few decades. A framework that would help me to make sense of an often confusing and political history, and that would transcend the narrow ideological definitions of Kemalist historiography, and I'll define what that is in a minute. Apart from Erik Jan Zürcher's standard work on Turkey's modern history, which actually really peters out towards the 1990s, there was no synoptic overview to respond to these needs. What was and still is available are generalist histories of Turkey, which focus on the Republican period and which are very much shaped by the discursive structures of Kemalist historiography. By Kemalist historiography, I mean Turkey's official historical narrative as it was set out in the 1920s under the guidance of the leader and founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal. Whether you take Stanford Shaw, Bernard Lewis, even Andrew Mango, and more recently Norman Stone, in fact, you will read Turkish history as a teleological story of nation building against all odds, initiated by the charismatic leader of the War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal, and brought to full fruition with the foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. To a considerable extent, these are hagiographies of Atatürk and his reforms. There is much whitewashing of what was, especially in its first decades, an often ruthless and brutal authoritarian regime. Of course, we should not forget that these authors were, in fact, really personally impressed by the achievements of the Republic, which were there as well, but from a critical perspective, they did not delve into the very dark sides of that history. Hence, the key themes of these histories are the revolutions of Mustafa Kemal, issues around contemporary civilization, and the focus on laiklik or laicity. And these are, of course, also founding aspects of the ideology of the Turkish nation state. Now, many of these histories of Turkey, however, are also defined by what they are not about. Kurds, for instance, they constituted between 15 to 20% of the society, yet they only figured, often actually without being called as such, as threats to national unity and as backward tribal rebels who attacked the Republic out of religious zealotry. And we have a growing number of scholarship now on how within the Turkish Republic an Orientalist perspective towards the Kurds was developed, which has a lot in common with, for instance, French Orientalist perspectives on Berbers. What was also not there were Armenians and other non-Muslim minorities who were completely written out of these histories. Their sudden disappearance in 1915 from the territory of what would later become the Turkish Republic would be mentioned if at all in passing. This is all the more problematic as the Armenians were, of course, a very important constituent community of the empire, which played a key role in the cultural and political life of the Ottomans. Ottoman high culture, architecture, and music is unimaginable without the massive contribution of Armenians over the centuries. Yet in these accounts, they existed only as traitors and revolutionaries who rebelled against the Ottomans. And in Norman Stone's book, even in his last book, that's their role, it seems. What is also absent? The Alevis, who also make up 15% roughly of society, they share a religious culture or have a religious culture that is significantly different from that of the Sunni Muslim majority of Turkey's society and also of its state, of course. Alevi history has been one of suffering at the hands of a Sunni state, whether under Ottoman or under Republican rule, but it has not been so much as mentioned in the histories I've referred to. And even more tellingly, what is also absent is the majority of conservative Muslims who were not part and parcel of this narrative. Many Muslims, religious scholars, their disciples felt alienated by the radical lifestyle reforms of the Republic, by the abolishment of Ottoman Arabic script, and the closure of all religious schools in the 1920s. Their voices were not heard in these accounts, and they were symbolically reduced to obscurantist enemies of enlightenment and progress. The state of the literature on modern Turkey reflected really until the late 1980s the hegemony of the Kemalist elites and their monopoly on defining what modernity is and how and about whom the history of Turkey can be written. Today, of course, this hegemony is now being challenged from a growing number of social, political, and religious actors to the point that we can assert that Kemalist hegemony is on the wane. True, the outward symbols of the Kemalist period are still there. You still see the many busts of Atatürk, many of them erected after the military coup of 1980. Children in primary schools still have to recite every morning the rather racist oath that ends with the exclamation, "Happy who calls himself a Turk," and which before actually says something much worse, like that I sacrifice my physical being to the altar of the nation or something along those lines. And the history taught in school books is still mostly a history of the victorious elites of the War of Independence and not a history of the people of Turkey. Yet, as I argue in Angry Nation, this facade of Kemalist rhetoric has lately been displaced by a much more emotive, if as surreal, a narrative. This time, it is neo-Ottoman revisionism and a nostalgia for an imagined imperial Islamic past. Sometimes one thinks that Prime Minister Erdogan fantasizes about himself as a future neo-Ottoman sultan watching over his domains from the balcony not of the AKP headquarters in Ankara, but of Topkapı Palace, with Sultana Emine at his side, of course. Now, more importantly, a growing number of critical scholars, particularly in anthropology, politics, and sociology, less so in history, have challenged and refuted the fabrications and the omissions of Republican history. Yet this project of solidifying the challenge to Kemalist historiography and the attempt to bring in different stories into this novel framework is a relatively new one. In Angry Nation, I'm trying to respond to this gap in literature and propose a framework to reread contemporary Turkey from a radical critical, or if you so wish, from a post-Kemalist and non-neo-Ottoman perspective. So how does a critical history of contemporary Turkey look like, and what are its core themes and actors? I would like to propose to you that a critical post-Kemalist history of contemporary Turkey would need to be based on the following substantive suggestions. A critical history would read the official historiography not as history, but as a discourse shaped by its time and used above all as a tool for nation building, regime consolidation, and propagation of a certain identity of Turkishness. It would assume that all themes in this historiography are discursive fields of symbolic domination that needs to be taken not at face value, but as positions in an ongoing struggle of power. This is particularly true for the question of Turkish identity. Here it is about the imposition of a Turkish ethno-religious identity as universal, what Baskın Orhan, the Turkish sociologist, has called Lahasümüt, the laik Hanefi Sunni Muslim Turks, which is in a way the equivalent of the American WASPs. The issue of Kurds as backward and tribal people, the presence or absence of Armenians, Greeks, non-Muslims, and the suggestion also that the Turkish Republic was established as a secular state, which I will in a minute argue has never been actually secular. In this light, a critical history of Turkey is shaped by the perspectives and memories not only of those in power, of the victorious ruling elites, but of what different scholars have called the subaltern, the disempowered, or the willfully marginalized. In particular, it thinks of the state as a behemoth that is above all interested in the perpetuation of its grip on society and institutional power. This behemoth is ready to do everything to ward off challenges to its hegemony, whether they come from socialists, from Islamists, or Kurds, historically speaking. This can be, of course, achieved through different ways, through manipulation, conspiracies, promoting intergroup violence, and sometimes also large-scale ethnic conflict. In addition, the state is also the main locale of structural violence where both torture and dispersive violence is employed to sustain power and ideological hegemony. This critical approach understands the recent history of Turkey as a field of many struggles over power between elected representatives and non-elected guardians of the Republic. And by guardians of the Republic, I mean the network of the military high command, the high judiciary, and the high bureaucracy. This network is also often referred to as a deep state, even though the limits between the deep state and the proper state are often rather fluid. Even though this looks like a war between good Democrats and evil conspirators, and this is how the current government under the Justice and Development Party has often tried to depict it, they as representatives of the people fighting against the bad deep state. In reality, it's much messier. This is a messy struggle where both sides often use the same dirty methods of manipulating parts of society for their particular interests. So a critical history of Turkey is hence more concerned with how state behavior has determined the lives of people beyond elite circles and beyond also the more developed parts of Western Turkey, which of course have been at the center of much of the discussion before. So these are my suggestions for approaching a post-nationalist, post-Kemalist, and non-Neo-Ottomanist revision of the history of Turkey. And before turning to some of the conclusions of my study, I would like to say a few words on the methodology which I used, and also introduce you to the way the book works. So, as I said, the critical reconsideration of Turkey's recent past has just begun. And there is a growing high-quality scholarship in different disciplines, which really have dispelled the myths of the Republic and brought back some reality into the debate. Many of these revisionist approaches share a common critical angle, yet by definition they're particularistic accounts because often also they come from outside history or from sub-fields. So they narrate histories of Kurds, of Armenians, the history of the genocide, even the history now of LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual people. This is one of those wonderful acronyms, but basically of people who belong to sexual minorities or to religious minorities like the Alevis. So these are histories which don't speak to each other. They all, in a way, try to develop their own hermeneutically closed, sufficient histories. And my question is, and I think the main question is really how to bring these different perspectives into a framework that still makes sense and helps us understand the complexity of societal processes in Turkey. So for this book, I've returned to the methodology of which I used in my DPhil thesis, and to what one of my supervisors called a very permissive understanding of ethnographic fieldwork, which builds on expert interviews, participant observation, and archival studies. So at the core of this book are conversations with people who have played significant public roles as activists, academics, or politicians. Many of them have a liberal or socialist perspective, some are of Kurdish nationalist backgrounds, others come from movements rooted in political Islam, but all of them are known for their moral integrity. And to give you a flavor of how I used some of these voices, and also to introduce some of the key themes in this book, I'd like to read out to you two passages. The first is by Osman Ulagay, who is a left-wing liberal and actually one of the first journalists in Turkey to write on economic issues, which is pretty amazing if you think about the prevalence of the economy in Turkish newspapers today. So the veteran of economic journalism in Turkey, Osman Ulagay, remembers that his colleagues were surprised at the very idea of a dedicated column on economic affairs when he first started writing it in the newspaper Cumhuriyet in the early 1980s. So, and then I quote him, "It was a time when Ankara reigned supreme and the only regular economic news in the papers referred to the fluctuations in the daily gold rate. The economy was an extension of politics and the state. But this state failed to deliver. Civil servants had to wear their overcoats in their offices because the state lacked the funds to pay for heating fuel. Very few economists believed that Özal, who introduced these, the main economic changes and then later became prime minister in '83, that Özal would be able to transform the economic system, and even fewer really understood the gravity of the changes he was introducing. In economic terms, the decisions of the 24th January meant the dawn of a new age." So I think this is really one of those highly relevant insights, as today it is almost impossible to imagine Turkey as anything but a neoliberal success story, where private enterprise, entrepreneurialism, personal achievement, and wealth generation have become defining characteristics, if not like probably the dominant ideology in many ways. Turkey today is a thoroughly capitalist country with a highly commodified culture of the everyday. Yet only 30 years ago, this was a Turkey without economy sections in the newspapers. And it's good to remember that. The second quote deals with the cultural policies of the military coup in 1980. Originally I had another quote, but I see that there are a few people in the audience who've been to another book launch of mine, so rather than boring them with the same quote, I'll go for another one. And this is about what happened with the military coup in 1980, which really shook Turkey to its grounds and in many ways started or created the foundations for the Turkey we know today. And this is from Turkish State TV, which back then in the early 1980s had one channel, which was black and white. And then I think in '84 they had a second channel, which was also black and white, and eventually they became color TVs. Throughout the years of military rule, State TV regularly featured a clip with the singer Müsherref Akay. Dressed in a red uniform and cap reminiscent of a 1930s stewardess's dress, complete with the crescent and star, a blonde curly-haired Akay performed the song "Turkey My Paradise," while tanks and soldiers in combat uniform marched on in the background, alternating with touristic images of Turkey's monuments. The lyrics of the song were a crash course in the ideology of the 12th September regime. The 12th September was the date of the military coup. Akay sang the first part of this song in an agitated, deep voice and with a belligerent expression, and then shifted to angelic mode and smile. I'm not going to sing it, but I'll read it out. And if you think it doesn't rhyme in English, it doesn't really rhyme in Turkish either. Betrayal has infiltrated my heroic race. In all hearts there is suffering and hatred. My enemies are not brave, they're cowards. There is no friendly nation to the Turk. Then the angelic turn. Let us celebrate the principles of our father, who is Mustafa Kemal, of course. Let us run towards the goals he has shown us. Turkey, Turkey, my paradise, my nation without compare. Turkey, My Paradise was commissioned by the generals and used systematically throughout the junta years as background to torture sessions in the prisons of the regime. A survivor of such torture, the music producer Cem Yılmaz bought the rights to the song in 2007 to prevent any further performance of it in public. So you're not going to hear it. So this story of Müsherref Akay's terrible success and her final downfall is actually also a story of the military coup of 1980. And think, for instance, that General Evren, the leader of that coup, is now finally being questioned for his crimes 30 years later, and just before probably his death. Tellingly, both quotes are from around the same period. They refer to the early 1980s and the transformation of power from the military dictators to the motherland party government under Prime Minister Turgut Özal after the elections of 1983. So when basically the Turkey we know today was coming into being. And it's this mismatch between economic liberalization and extreme authoritarianism, if not fascism, between the emergence of new economic opportunities and the persistence of in-your-face authoritarianism, which is paradoxical. It reminds us of the initial contradiction between model and anger, with which I began my presentation and with the reference to Cairo. Yet it runs through much of the narrative of Angry Nation and in fact also through the drama that is Turkey's recent history. Which brings me to my final point, and probably the most important one, which are the main structural forces and actors at work in Turkey who keep its people angry. And once the mobile phone is switched off, we'll continue. So obviously the responses to this question are still patchy, but in a nutshell, I argue that modern Turkey has been shaped by a number of overlapping conflicts over power. At the very heart of all these contestations is a behemoth, as I've called him, the Turkish Leviathan, the state, which of course preceded the Turkish Republic by several hundred years. The Turkish Republic was established by the national cadres of the Committee of Union and Progress, we know that. It was a one-party dictatorship under the leadership of the Republican People's Party, based on an ideology of authoritarian modernism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Republic changed the visible layers of Turkish society, particularly in the western provinces, by introducing European dress, legal codes, and social norms. Yet the Republican experiment was shaped as much by rupture and change as it was by continuity. Rather than establishing, for instance, a secular arrangement between state and religion, which much of the historiography I mentioned in the beginning would have done, the Republican nation builders continued the Ottoman tradition of controlling the practice and administration of Islam by the state. So there goes another Republican myth about Turkey being the only secular Muslim country. In fact, it never was a secular state, and we can discuss this in more detail if you like. With the introduction of multi-party politics in 1946, and more so with the election of the Democrat Party in 1950, the one-party dictatorship officially came to an end. Yet, and I think this is important, its autocratic core was never fully dissolved, and this is a point which I was really made aware of when I was in Egypt. Because there it was, of course, the National Democrat Party, which was the party of the state for almost 60 decades, and the first thing after the revolution was to disband it. But today, many observers in Egypt are concerned that the old guards will keep their positions of power and the revolution will come to naught. And this is really what, well, not exactly what happened in Turkey in the 1950s, but what happened in the 1950s was that the Republican People's Party was not only not disbanded, but it continued as the main opposition party throughout the history of modern Turkey. And this network of old guards then morphed into a parallel structure within the bureaucracy, the military and the judiciary, and of course also in parts of the Republican People's Party, and created what we call the deep state or the guardian state. So ever since the 1950s, the result has been a relatively unique model, but I hope that's not the model they are trying to copy in the Arab world, a unique model of what I would call contested coexistence of two actors, of non-elected guardians and elected representatives. In most cases, the elected representatives were of the center-right, i.e. economically liberal and socially conservative. There were also two brief periods when the Republican People's Party went left of center and became democratic, or appeared as democratic in the 1970s under Ecevit, and now in 2011 under Kılıçdaroğlu. With the exceptions of military interventions in, and there were many, 60, 71, 80, 97, elections were held regularly and generally fair and free. Key policies areas, however, citizenship, regional development, foreign policy, remained under the tutelage of the guardians for a very long time. Dissenting movements, whether socialist, nationalist, or Islamist, and even center-right parties sometimes were reined in, oppressed, or crushed. The history of political parties in Turkey is a particularly insightful case. If you buy the book, you will have this wonderful table here, which is an overview of political parties in Turkey. So what I did is, because there are many parties in Turkey, and I've grouped them around the main political clusters, which is Islamist, left-wing socialist, conservative, Islamist, Turkish nationalist, and pro-Kurdish. And when you look at that table, you will see that all parties but the Kemalist People's Party were eventually closed down either by military dictatorships or by the Constitutional Court. The Republican People's Party was the only party which was banned only once, and that was in 1980 when all parties were banned. Yet this was when the leaders really completely destroyed the political fabric of the country. And it's also the only brief period of around 10 years when the Republican People's Party was not involved in power. So with this hybrid system, the Turkish case after 1980 was distinguishable, was different from both the authoritarian regimes of the Middle East and from the relatively more mature democracies of Southern Europe, although many of them, well, some of the more mature democracies of Southern Europe, like Italy and Greece, don't look that great these days. So the difference here, however, was that the continued existence of elected governments on the one side and of unelected guardians on the other continued. The guardian's role was to ensure that no government would steer away from whatever the elites believed to be in the best interest of state preservation. And in order to keep to this goal, they used all means possible. There is little doubt, for instance, that almost all cases of violence, intergroup conflict, and political mayhem did not happen spontaneously or as the result of long-standing, age-old enmities between Alevis and Sunnis, or between Kurds and Turks. They were, in fact, and this is what investigations and court cases bring to the fore these days, instigated and executed by the guardians and their collaborators within and outside the state apparatus. To give only a few examples from the period under study, we can cite the assassination of probably more than 2,000 Kurdish intellectuals and activists during the Kurdish war in the 1980s and 90s, and now there's this process of unearthing mass graves in different parts of the Kurdish provinces, the political murders of dozens of critical Turkish intellectuals and activists in the 1990s who were getting too much information about the deep state, but also the massacre of Alevis in Sivas in 1993, the murder of Christian missionaries in the mid-2000s, and then finally the murder of Turkish-Armenian journalist Trumpet in 2007, which so far is the last of these murders because many of their responsibles are in jail at the moment because of the Ergenekon investigation and court case. We know now that the guardians have been responsible for all of these and many other events. These were used to shape politics and to ensure that power remains with the guardians despite elections brought in others. Based on the exploration of these and many other incidents in the book, I suggest that it is this manipulative nature of the guardian state that is at the root of the anger in the political system of Turkey and, of course, also in the larger society of Turkey. Add to this the massive violence meted out by security forces throughout the Kurdish war, which killed between 35 and 40,000 people, together with the once widespread use of police violence and torture in custody, and you get a sense of the gravity of the abuse and violence that underpins Turkey's history. The years through roughly between 2002 and 2005, with the Justice and Development Party in power and the European Union accession firmly in place, were exceptional. They saw a real solidification of the rule of law, a strengthening of human rights, and an opening of the political space. Yet ever since 2005, this has really turned into stagnation, and recently we're seeing something of a return to the default of semi-authoritarian politics. But now you will ask me, fine, is Turkey really all about anger and violence? Is this such a wretched country? And if it's so wretched, why should we be interested in it? Is it all about political manipulation and the perpetuation of state reason rather than the good life of its citizens. And I should say it certainly is not. Despite the viciousness and the polarization of the political field of society and economy, especially since the liberal mid-1980s under Özal, have gone through massive change. Economic growth has continued at a high rate of an average 5 to 6, 7% throughout 30 years, despite, of course, cycles of boom and bust, which we by now all know are intrinsically linked to the existence of capitalism. Massive economic crises, reflective of the political conflicts, shattered many lives in the late 1990s and particularly in 2001. Regional development disparities, especially between the Kurdish East and the predominantly Turkish West, continue, and they also exist between North and South, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, so poverty is still an issue. Yet anyone who has been to Turkey in the last decade or so will not fail to note how the experience of everyday life has changed for the very vast majority of its people. Sleepy Anatolian cities in the country's heartland have become thriving industrial cities with an export base and global outreach. The middle classes and the general levels of wealth have massively expanded. Socially conservative middle classes have emerged out of marginalized urban slums and moved into the center of cities and into the center of power, a process which is very impressively described by Cihan Tugal. A rapidly modernizing infrastructure from transportation to housing and public spaces has revolutionized the experience of everyday life. In terms of cultural productions, there's also a lot to say. The dire years of the post-coup environment where Müşerref Akay with her terrible song would be aired on TV are over, as well as the straitjacket of Kemalist modernity. Turkey has never been as productive as it is now, from film to literature, from art to music, and from internationally acclaimed TV series to pop music. And the TV series actually, they're not watched in the UK yet. I doubt that it will happen. But I've realized that the westernmost expansion is in Croatia. So there must be a relationship with the Ottoman Empire. But Istanbul today is one of the culturally most intriguing places in Europe and the Middle East, and really is a meeting place for people from different backgrounds. And yet, we are far from a tidal point after which the anger would begin to subside. The struggle between guardians and elected representatives continue, this time with the Justice and Development Party as main protagonist. As in the late 1950s under Menderes, or probably also during Prime Minister Özal's rule in the second half of the 1980s, the challenges of the guardians seem to be falling back into the mindsets and methods of their former tormentors. We've heard a lot recently about the Ergenekon cases, and, which are against the guardian state, becoming a vehicle for government control and for taking revenge on their former political foes. Assaults on the freedom of the press by the government suggest a return to the default option of semi-authoritarian politics. And without the anchor of EU accession, there seem to be few alternatives, and this is an anchor that is now largely defunct. The Kurdish challenge continues, and we shall see how far the government will be able to go to appease Kurdish concerns. And the question of a new liberal constitution that replaces the junta's 1982 document, constitution, is looming large over the new parliament. At the same time, the country continues to grow economically. It becomes a more internationally more respectable country. Debates on whether Turkey could become a model for the Arab world continue, even if it is clearly not yet transforming itself into a liberal democracy. But Turkey remains to cast a spell over us with its peculiar combination of social and economic dynamism on the one side and a political system characterized by authoritarian reflexes on the other. In Angry Nation, I'm trying to picture Turkey's recent past as it has been shaped by these dynamics, by the guardians who always lurk behind the scene, the polarization which sets the stage, and the drama that keeps unfolding on the screen. And it is this drama which keeps unfolding and continuing, and whose end is not yet in sight, and it is this drama that I've tried to capture and discuss, elucidate in Angry Nation, and I'd be very interested to hear your views in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kerem. I'm going to, if I may exploit my position as chairman, to ask the first question. I'm struck by the extent to which, on the one hand, Kerem describes the past 10 years in Turkey as not an unqualified success, but an enormous success in which a great deal has changed. But Kerem, you tend to describe it in the passive sense. I mean, this has been done, that has been done. Whereas when you talk about political actors in the active sense, they've all done terrible things. So is there a sort of disjuncture between, as I say, your description of probably everyone except Özal as having been in one way or another bad for Turkey, and your description of things nowadays, with success ascribed to no one in particular, as nonetheless highly successful?
Well, that's a great question, I guess, and I think that I am, in the book at least, much clearer about the Justice and Development Party's role in that success. I might have been a bit more reticent after the shift which we've been seeing, especially before the elections, towards a more authoritarian politics. But there is no question that the Justice and Development Party is one of those big, also one of those big success stories, which actually Cihan Tugal, the Yale-based anthropologist and sociologist, described for the Welfare Party, for the Refah Party, and the AKP in many ways continued that mission, and that is to carry the disadvantaged, marginalized lower classes, which in many Muslim majority countries in the Arab world would tend towards extremist Islamism, carried them into the center of power and made them part of a status quo interested middle-class society who are above all interested in their personal achievement and in the betterment of their personal lives. And in that respect, they have played a massively important historical role. The question now is what they're going to do now that they have fulfilled this historical role.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
I'd be interested to know what you think about the position of the business elite, who, you can't visit Istanbul now without being struck by a city awash with money. Some of it, by all accounts, pretty hot money as well. But do the business elite side more with the Guardians or with the other side? Where do they position themselves?
That's a great question, and the answer is, at the moment, there are probably two business elites. The older business elites who owe some of their success, at least, and not only the business elites, also the industrialists, the oldest industrialists, the old bourgeoisie, which owes some of their success, at least, to the policies of the Republic, and most big holdings, historical holdings, are an outcome of the policy, actually, of the creation of a Muslim indigenous bourgeoisie, which goes back to the Committee of Union and Progress and to 1915 and the appropriation of Armenian businesses and so on. So there's that business elite. And then there is a new business elite, which is very much linked to the Justice and Development Party, to the new upwardly mobile cities in central Anatolia, in Kayseri and so on, who definitely side with the Justice and Development Party. However, of course, this is changing, I think, and the moment this polarization could be overcome, and the moment the Guardian state would really be put into its, or taken out of the political system, there is no reason why these two business elites should not completely merge. I mean, we already see a development towards that in the sense that TÜSİAD, for instance, is the the old business elite, the Association of Turkish Businessmen, and Müsiat is the new one, the one secular, the other Islamist. But you already see that the richest and the most successful members of Müsiat have actually now become members of TÜSİAD. So I think if historical process is allowed to take its course without further manipulation, then we would certainly see just one business elite. But at the moment, we still have these two different elites, and they have also different they have different organizations and different institutional power bases.
Yeah, first of all, that Bill.
Thanks. It seems to me that when we, particularly when we think about Turkey, we tend to think of its history as marching in a particular direction. I think that partly comes from the Kemalist European Western destiny for the country, but also from the story of EU accession. We don't do that in quite the same way with most other societies that we study. So I wonder if you could take out these kind of teleological approaches to Turkish history. If in your book or in your thinking you have any notion of the direction that Turkey might actually be taking. And maybe as a sort of sub-question or subplot to that, you mentioned about the Turkish drama that going on and on and on. I mean, might it be that that is the Turkish end story? That a constant contestation, if you like, between different ideas of modernity, or between, let's, for shorthand, say, Islamism and secularism, or Kemalism, that never quite finishes, changes its form, but continues in that vein. So my question is, what happens if we take away from Turkey the idea that it is going in a particular direction?
Mm-hmm. I guess we have a much more exciting story to tell, because this teleological perspective is often a smokescreen behind which we fail to see what's really going on in the society. And there's at least one very big example which we see at the moment where Greece, we have been looking at Greece through this teleological perspective. But it's not only teleological but also essentialist, because it's European, and now it's getting ever more European thanks to the European Union. But we've actually seen that the Europeanization process became a smokescreen behind which we fail to see both the structures and the real developments in Greek society. And I think that the Kemalist narrative has done pretty much the same in Turkey. When we look at how the ideology of Kemalism, for instance, on issues of women's rights and so on, has impacted the way we look at Turkey, it's quite impressive. You know, you see this, the whole, and Turkish elites, including myself probably 10 years ago, would have said that, Turkey is much more advanced in terms of women's rights than the Middle East. It's because it's much more Europeanized and so on. But in fact, when you look at the representation of women in the Turkish parliament, it's been roughly around 4% between 1932, which was the first elections when women were elected, and 2002. 4.5%, and often below that, a negligible number of female MPs. And despite our fears of Turkey probably going to the east, or not being as Western before, the representation of women has actually gone in 2002 from 2002 to 2007 to 8%, and now it's around 14%, and there are 78 female members of parliament. Has never been there before in the history of the Turkish parliament. And still, because at the moment the Kemalist and EU perspective is not there, we now look from a different teleology probably, and everything has to go worse. I mean, that's at least some who see it that way. I think that is so. I think that there's much more we can see once we give up the teleology, and I'm not sure. Whether, the question on the direction that Turkey might be taking is, of course, important, but I think one of the outcomes of my work and others people's work is that, first of all, Turkey was not going towards Europe or becoming ever more European and ever more liberal anyway. It's just that we thought it did, but behind that, a lot of other things happened. And now that probably this Europeanization, or this very narrowly defined, early 20th century Westernization is over, we're seeing that still, there are interesting developments, and women are empowered and so on. So whether the Turkish drama will be always a drama, of course, I don't know. The question is, how much conflict can a society take? And if that conflict and contestation is carried into the intellectual and political sphere, then I think it can be very fruitful. If it continues to be manipulated and and violent, then it's destructive. But what we've seen is the emergence of or the massive expansion of the middle class, and middle classes, by definition, tend to be less interested in conflict because they have more to lose. So I would assume that some sort of moderation, and probably also some sort of, hybrid modernities would come into play, especially now that the European Union perspective is not only in place anymore, but also the European Union is not really that much in place anymore. Yes.
I've got three, maybe more, but I'm going to start grouping them into three. I think you were first. Yes, you. No, I'm sorry. No.
I have a question regarding what you were saying about the Guardian, or the deep state, this rather sinister body that you were describing in the background in Turkey, sort of pulling the strings. I may have misunderstood, but I believe you were suggesting that this was a legacy from Ottoman central rule, of a sort of autocratic rule. If that's not the case, you can tell me how I was wrong. But I was really wondering what you thought the origin of this sort of deep state, or these guardians. What was the origin of them, where they came from?
Thank you. I'm going to do. Could you give your Clement?
I read your book with very great interest, actually, and must congratulate you on it, and it's very instructive indeed. The only trouble is, I find I rather like guardians, especially in democracies. Otherwise, democracies run away with themselves, because democracies are also meant to be republics, and a republic means the public interest, and someone as well has to look after that, rather sort of, behind the scenes, so to speak, very often, as in France, or to a certain extent here, notably in France, and even in the United States, actually. But when most legislation that comes to the United States actually comes from the presidency. Anyway, that's the general point. And why I particularly worry about your thesis, actually, is a period from 1960 to 1980. When that period, when you see the guardian state, as it were, coming in and making mischief, whereas, in fact, I think one has to remember between 60 and 80, Turkey was going through quite rapid economic and social development, with ups and downs, unfortunately. Instead, it wasn't very steady, and there was a great deal of dissatisfaction, leading to violence, leading to many theories being developed, political theories of one sort or another, in extreme, being developed by the intelligentsia, and responding to these rapid changes in society, like the growth of trade, of labour and so on, and the type of capitalists who are beginning to emerge. And all that, I think, didn't come from the military. I think it came from the actual leaders, particularly the rather intelligentsia type of leader in the society. And very unfortunately, if you remember, between 70 and 80, the bureaucracy, part of the guardian state, disintegrated. You see it in Kalajoglu's books and so on, when he describes how, these ministries were completely politicized and therefore, absolutely thrown open. The whole society was actually chaotic, and there's a great deal of violence. And the military, thank goodness, intervened, and you do mention that. But this is a point when the bureaucracy had broken down, and the military came in and tried to put it right. Now, one doesn't like a rule of the military, and they do all sorts of vicious and nasty things once they're in power, as you rightly say. But someone had to guard the democracy as such as it was in those times.
Clement, I think
the military did it, and I wonder if you
running out
agree.
of time. Thanks. There's a question back there next, Claire, all the way back on the other side, down there.
Yes, you talk about the Guardians, but I want to maybe suggest that the AK Party has become part of the establishment and is now in collusion with the Guardians. I was in Turkey on election night, and it was a very smooth process. I think there's quite a lot of optimism. The Kurdish independents had increased their vote in Parliament. People thought there may be kind of real progress on constitutional change. Then a week later, there's turmoil again. But in the sense of the AK Party in its position, it could make, particularly with the new leadership of the GHP, which had been critical and supportive of some constitutional changes, quite easily the restrictive constitution could be changed if there was a political will from the party. And at the moment, I mean, I think that it's easy for the Guardians to interpret the law the way they do. The problem is the way the law is written.
Yeah, so if I can... fairly briefly. Okay, if I can start with the last question, I completely agree. The AK Party, that's why I've not been that good in praising the AK Party, because in many ways it has become, well, I'm not so sure whether it has become part of the Guardians yet, but there definitely is much less interest on the government to come to a reckoning with the Guardians now that they're in full power, and that was ultimately the AK Party's goal, which ultimately is probably most political parties' role, is to be in full power. And it's now that it's actually for the first time that the AKP is in full power, and we're going to see in the next few years what that means. It's still early to say, but as you say, if they wanted to, and if the Republican People's Party is really as committed to the rhetoric it has been representing, we don't know to what extent that is really the main position in the party. I mean, there's a lot of internal discussion there going on still. But if the Republican People's Party continues that politics and the AK Party is interested in changing the constitution, then there's no reason why they shouldn't. And until now, they've always been able to blame it on the Guardians or to blame it on the Republican People's Party. They won't be able to do it this time. So it's, in many ways, I think it's crunch time, and we will see what comes out of it. Clement Dodd's comment on the Guardians, and thanks a lot for your praise, and your view on the Guardians. I understand that there might be a need for safeguards, especially in a country like Turkey. But when, for instance, I was in Cairo yesterday, and people were talking about following the Turkish model, they were talking about, so what role should the military play, and should they be the Guardians? And I would think that the lesson from the Turkish experience is that, yes, we may want to have Guardians, but are you sure you want to have the military, which is not a force which you can, which can be held accountable by anybody in the country? And the track record of the military is a rather patchy and unfortunate one. And I completely agree, as you said in the 70s, how the whole society in Turkey disintegrated into hostile, mutually hostile political camps, and the state also disintegrated. And then the army came in and yes, forced everything back together in shape, but it came at a very high cost. And the question is whether that was the only way. And the kind of societal cost which was paid was very high in terms of lives and in terms of the destruction of many democratic beginnings. So I'm not sure whether the lesson from this Guardian state intervention in Turkey should be that we need a non-accountable Guardian. I think it really has to be an accountable one. And the first question, the argument has been made that these clandestine structures actually go back much further, and you could indeed suggest that the Committee of Union and Progress in many ways was such a clandestine structure, and that is, of course, one of the main moments where Turkish nationalism and modernism solidifies, and it was a political movement with a party and a non-visible core which was running the affairs. So yes, maybe there is that historical precedent, and I think particularly after the 1960 military coup, there was a reinstatement. So that's the historical perspective I would suggest there.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last round. Yes, one here.
My question is about freedom and freedom of speech in Turkey, because we call ourselves a democratic country, but I don't think real democracy really runs in Turkey, since I've been hearing horror stories like 2 undercover police visiting, that happened in the last couple of days, somebody's home because they were writing in ekşisözlük.com supposedly something against Muhammad and Allah, and policemen actually visited their homes and asking them to come to the police station, and things like that. When you hear them, you get really scared. And recently there was also the argument about banning the internet and controlling people's where they can visit and what they can do online. So basically, my question is this the doing of AK Party? And if it is so, how can 50% of the voters can choose them again? And if not, then what is causing that control paranoia in Turkey? It seems to me like the government is trying to control people more and more with raising the alcohol and tobacco buying age to 24. And last thing I heard was in Istanbul, any table outside the restaurants wouldn't have alcohol. And to me, it seems like we are going backward rather than forward. What is your view on the future of Turkey, and especially the young generation? Are they going to have freedom, or is it going to be?
It's just behind you.
My question's on neo-Ottomanism within the military sector. When I was in Kabul, I noticed all the former Ottoman countries were underneath Turkish control: Albania, Bulgaria, Azeris, Georgians, so on. And in light of that, and that the Turkish government seems to get along better with the Kurds of northern Iraq than it does its own, and then the possible implosion of the Syrian state, how does this fit in?
Any more? One more? Two more. The last will be Michael, and then one at the back, and that's absolutely okay.
I'd just like to add a coda to the first question. In one of his last columns before he was fired from today's Zaman, Andy Finkel talked about increasing self-censorship in the Turkish press. And at a conference I was at in Izmir 5 weeks ago, this question was raised again, and a panelist responded to the question, is there more self-censorship in the Turkish press? She made a very long pause and then said, I have never known anything like it. Words to that effect. So is there self-censorship now in this time of ferment and on and on and on? Thank you.
And last of all, round back.
Yes, if you'll permit another question about the guardians. I mean, in the talk you've presented them, if not particularly platonically, as platonic guardians, as sort of ideologues. I mean, is there a story about material interests as well? Political relationships of a more mundane kind than theories of the state?
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for these wonderful questions. I wish I had 20 minutes to answer. How many minutes do I have?
They're all desperate for a drink.
Okay, good. So it's either drink or discussion. The first question, freedom of speech, internet, alcohol bans, there is a lot of that control policy in the government. There are also movements against that. I mean, you know that the alcohol ban for people under 24 has not become effective because it's been struck down by the senior court. But they're definitely. I mean, let's not forget this is not the AK Party is not a liberal democrat party. It's an Islamist party, which has gone a long way in becoming post-Islamist or neo-Islamist. But when you speak to the core cadres, they wouldn't, they wouldn't hide the fact that what they want is a society which is governed by the principles of an Islamic, of the Islamic family, of an Islamic society. It's in many ways an Islamic version of the Christian Democrat parties of the 1970s. You might not like that. I don't particularly like these policies, but some of them are legitimate for a political party in government. Others are not. I mean, when it comes to freedoms of expression, when it comes to the government's very problematic relationship with the media, that is highly problematic. Well, if you ask where this urge to control comes from, let's not forget the political environment within which the AK Party government has been operating. And that included a court case against the presidency of Abdullah Gül in 2007, a closure case against the AKP in 2008. That the AKP cadres would act from this slightly, almost neurotic perspective is also in part explained by the political forces within which they have operated. So, and this is in a way the political system reproducing itself, which is very sad. And when you now look at the AK Party's Kurdish policy, for instance, it's exactly like the Republican People's Party's policy was a few years ago, and they don't see that they've actually fallen into this into these cycles of Turkish politics where they then become act on behalf of those in power and suddenly see the Kurds as their main enemies, and they don't see that they're being divided by someone else there. I mean, part of that is really deeply in the Turkish experience. Turkey has, for most of its existence as a modern nation state, been an illiberal, a non-democratic place. And at the moment we see both these illiberal streaks, but we also see other streaks. I mean, today I've met a delegation from the University of Mardin in Oxford, and to have a delegation of people from a state university in Mardin in the Kurdish area on the Syrian border with people who are speaking, with the chair of the Kurdish Studies Department and the chair of the Syriac Studies Department, and people who work on local history and on Eastern Christianity. Now that is just amazing. You would never have imagined that this could be possible. So again, I think a lot of things are happening at the same time, but there are some developments which I find worrying as well, and where one has to struggle against. I mean, that's also for what you have opposition parties, and we will see to what extent the Republican People's Party will play that role. Because it's not, to be a democratic opposition party is a very new role for it, and we'll see how it will deal with that. The Ottoman, or the regional role of Turkey, I made a few notes here, but I didn't write down the question, which you could probably briefly remind me of.
Well, it was just an observation that in the military sphere that the peripheral states seem to be subordinate to Turkey in Afghanistan. Even the Greeks share the same barracks and mess hall.
The same?
The Greek contingent shares the same barracks and mess hall as the Turks. And then it also referenced the relationship of the Turkey to its neighbors, Syria and particularly northern Iraq.
Yeah. I mean, as we now know, the military, of course, is well organized, and it's actually been doing a much better job outside the country than in the country. I mean, in peacekeeping missions in Kosovo and Bosnia and Afghanistan and so on, where they have actually acted very commendably. And the fact, I didn't know that the Greeks were also in the story there. But, I mean, it, I think, is an expression of Turkey's larger appeal now to the region and, of course, of its foreign policy under Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who really has been able to translate this idea of, neo-Ottoman nostalgia into a workable program of combining political with economic power and using military power more as a as a way of not in order to attack other countries, but as part of peace missions. I think all in all, that is a very successful strategy. It's not always as successful. I mean, when Davutoglu goes to Bosnia and Sarajevo, he every now and then also makes speeches where he says things which put off everybody but the Muslims in the Balkans. And his speech in Sarajevo where he said, well, look at the Balkans and look at you now. You're just nowhere between Turkey and Europe, but you used to be in the center of world history, but only during the Ottoman Empire. So come back to us. That probably didn't go down that well. But if there's one thing about the AKP, especially in foreign policy, it has been its ability to learn from mistakes. So I think they're doing pretty well on the foreign policy front. But of course, the developments in Syria, especially, will be a big test because Ankara's strategy, as everybody else's strategy, of course, was based on the engagement with the current political elites there. And the question on self-censorship and Andi Finkel, there has always been self-censorship in Turkish newspapers and media. I mean, as I said, I think that Turkey has been, of course, I don't know the 60s, there were more was possible, but overall, when you take 20 to 2010, most of the times, this was a mostly authoritarian or authoritarianizing state where people thought twice what they did and where people almost always ended up in jail for what they wrote. And sometimes even poets like Nazım Hikmet, for instance, ended up in jail for pretty long periods of time. There certainly is, and I briefly said that in the talk, between 2002 and 2005, there was a very atypical period in Turkish politics. That's when somehow everything seemed possible and everything could be said, and European Union membership was an arm's reach away. And that atmosphere is not there anymore. That's for sure. And there's monopolization in the media. There's a big government bloc. There is the big Doğan bloc, which is not a government, and then there are kind of smaller medias. And the way the government is dealing with dissent has been becoming a bit more authoritarian. I think there's no question. But then at the same time, you have a lot of dissent, even in newspapers like Zaman. But of course, I mean, one where Andrew Finkel could have asked this question, could have asked himself this question before. I mean, if you write for the newspaper of the more or less of the government, then you might eventually come and see the limits of what you can say. I mean, probably that is not the main avenue to kind of criticize and to be critical. There are other newspapers where he could have done it probably even better. Maybe he'll start somewhere else. And the last question on the Guardian economic interests is of course very justified. There is that aspect. It's probably not as much in the center now, but of course the military-industrial complex in itself was an important economic power, especially after '60. The armed forces pension funds became a major economic player in the Turkish economy. And then after the 1997 coup, one of the main, when the military intervened in order to push the welfare party back, was to exclude all companies which were not secular from tenders of the armed forces. So that was a policy of pushing back the non-secular capital and bringing back the companies who were closer to the military and the government. So I think that was a major issue. But of course, that story is now a different one in the sense that there's no question that those that Oyak and so on doesn't have the economic power and political power it once had. So I think there already has been a great shift there. There's no question that the Yak Party has opened all the way for all other actors, and now they're also actually doing the same. I mean, they are excluding companies who are seen as being part of the secular side. And I think, as I said before, in the next, I mean, the coming few years will be really interesting to see whether the Yak Party can remain a moderate Islamist Muslim Democrat power once it has been able to take over much of the state and to push back much of the guardians.
Thank you very much, Kerem. I'm sorry we have run out of time. The serious point about going to have a drink is that Kerem is kindly joining us, and so I'm sure there's another opportunity for those of you who still have questions for him to ask them there, and it looks to me as though everyone's over 24, so under AKP policy you still get a drink. But first, I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking Kerem. It was, I think, an extremely stimulating, very interesting talk, and I've profited from it enormously. I'm sure everyone else has too. Thanks very much, Kerem.
The refreshments will be taking place in the council room, which is on your left-hand side as you exit the rear door. Thank you.
So we did, I mean, you know, an hour and a half, which is actually great. These are obviously not students. It's a very different crowd. They were very well informed. They're almost as good as the Greek ones. I was Greek questions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had a book launches in Greece and Cyprus as well.